Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln S. Farish here with my trusty pipe hawk. Last episode we talked about marriage as a stabilizing force, and I'm going to further reinforce that with a case study I found on Saudi Arabians who joined ISIS and their motivation for doing that. But remember, as always, these are my thoughts, not DoD, U.S. Army, or U.S. KPOX. Let's get started. One of the motivations for this video was I had run across an article that was interviewing a person fairly highly placed in the military who ran an unconventional organization. And the person stated that he did not understand why anyone would join the Islamic State. And the organization he ran could not come up with what was the motive for people joining ISIS. Why were people going there? What was the appeal? What was the allure? I had my own ideas and figured I should at least flesh out my theories with a bit of facts. And that's how I came across some rather interesting information. ISIS may have been an evil organization, and still is, but like all organizations, it had a bureaucratic side. And there was entry documents that everyone had to fill out if they were to join ISIS. When ISIS started to collapse, we were able to seize a bunch of these records and go through them and find out some of the motivations for why Saudis, at least, were joining ISIS, and what was their motivation, what did they want to do, and why. You can find that here on the link. This is all just internal Islamic State records from 2013 to 2014. Now, some of the important main findings was a lot of the tropes that you'll hear people throw out. Oh, they were losers and they joined, or oh, they needed money and that's why they joined, or oh, this, or oh, that. All BS. These guys joined for a very specific reason that I'll get to here in just a moment. But again, this is what the data showed. These were, the cohort of Saudi ISIS fighters were mostly young and represent a new type of Saudi jihadists, different from those that, say, followed Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. They weren't teenage adolescents, and they weren't loners, and they weren't outcasts, and they weren't, underachieving educationally. They had opportunities the same as everybody else, and, they could move upwards. They chose a different path. Mostly they came from an Al-Qassam province. We'll get to where exactly that was and what that means. But by numbers, they came from Riyadh, one of the larger cities. Here's Al-Qassam province, more or less in the middle of Saudi Arabia, fairly rural. So percentage-wise, people came from the countryside, as represented by Al-Qassam province. Number-wise, they came from Riyadh, very, very urban, very urbane. So this is the reason people joining ISIS was not just from one area or one group or one minority or one anything. This was a cross-cultural problem that Saudi Arabia had. Something was missing for these folks, and that's why they joined ISIS. Another trope that you'll often hear is these were people that were religiously motivated. That's why they joined ISIS, because they believed in the cause and they were down with the cause, and that's why they joined. And no, again, same thing. Political turmoil, instability, sectarianism in the region explains why they became radicalized or what the purpose of the radicalization was, rather than socioeconomic or ideology. These were folks that were radicalized once they got there, not beforehand. So ISIS, as a semi-global organization, would attempt to exploit sectarian faults in societies. They would tailor a message to a specific group of people within a country, within its particular issues. Rather than just a giant, hey, this is a religious calling, come join us, they would say, hey, look, you're getting shafted in Egypt, or you're getting shafted in Jordan, or hey, in Saudi Arabia, you're not getting the life you want. You're not getting the thing that you want there, but if you come join us, we can provide it for you. So they used very sophisticated narratives in each place where they were recruiting. So these folks were driven by a sectarian ideal and maybe adventure, bragging rights, boredom, or as I theorize, one other very specific point. While the fight with ISIS might have been a version of the 30 Years' War that happened in Germany, or the idea was it was going to be before we collapsed it, reality was It was an organization that was skillful in manipulating the secular issues that plague societies, mostly in the Middle East. So one of the observations they were able to get by comparing the documents is finding out the educational and financial situation of this cohort of Saudi jihadists. And they were more financially and educationally capable than previous generations, previous cohorts of jihadists that had gone to Afghanistan or had gone to other places to fight. The affinity or the greater participation rates may have had much more to do with the proximity of Syria to Saudi Arabia than any religious fervor. Once you showed up, you had to fill out an enlistment record. And from this, you provided all the following information. Now, the Saudi Arabians, or we who gave it to them probably, were able to glean or put together 759 documents, which represented a third of all the people from Saudi Arabia who joined ISIS. So this is a pretty good representation, really good cross sample, providing information of who joined, why they joined, their motivation, and what they were trying to get out of this. So of course, age is one of the things that you fill out in these documents, and the Saudis were able to compare with other generations of Saudi militants what the age was of people who joined ISIS in Syria, specifically in 2013, 2014. And that average age was 24, and that's an important number, so keep that in mind. But early jihad fronts, you had 20-year-olds, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula were 27, much older. But specifically, people joining ISIS were 24, and there was a reason. There it is. 73% of ISIS recruits were unmarried at the time of arrival. What's the average marriage age in Saudi Arabia? And what does it take to get married in Saudi Arabia? Average age of someone joining ISIS was 24. The average age of marriage in Saudi Arabia is 25. I throw out there the reason people joined ISIS was they couldn't get married. If you look at the bottom there, most cited reason, lack of financial resources for the dowry and the marriage ceremony. It's expensive to get married in Saudi Arabia. It's so expensive that about 20%, 3 million out of 15 million, are unmarried. These folks joined ISIS so they could either get the money for a wife, get a wife, or find a wife, because otherwise they had no shot. So ruling out a few more reasons why someone would join ISIS, both socioeconomics and theological. Now, 28% had never traveled, which means most of them had traveled outside of the country of Saudi Arabia before. So it wasn't a wanderlust, wandering mercenary kind of reason people joined ISIS. Definitely wasn't theological, because almost 60% had only basic Islamic knowledge once they joined. So it wasn't theology driving people to join. I would even say it wasn't ISIS picking on the mal-educated or the less bright, less intelligent, because 44% had attended high school, which was even higher than the average in Saudi Arabia. 15% had a bachelor's degree, even had some postgraduate degrees out there. I would say that, yes, the fact that a slightly higher than the national average in Saudi Arabia were unemployed, 14%, would be a factor, but it wasn't that ISIS gave them a better job. It was that ISIS could help them get the money they needed to afford the marriage price, the dowry, and the marriage ceremony. Because if your family doesn't have it and you can't get a job and you want to get married, what are your options? ISIS was recruiting hard, saying, look, we can get you money, we can get you a wife. Be tempting for some. So when a recruit joined ISIS, they were given three choices: fighter, Ishtihadidin, and Ingamashadidin. And I mess those up and I know it. Generic fighter, and then suicide bomber, which only 9% chose, and then a kind of kamikaze attacker, which only 6% chose. So again, theology was not the main motivator here. People were not coming here to sacrifice life and limb for ISIS. Also, on the theological side, previous jihad experience. Everyone was asked about that. 91% of the new people joining ISIS had none. Those that did were mostly from Syria, which was the battlefield itself, or Afghanistan. So people were joining ISIS for more secular reasons, not theological reasons. In an attempt to prevent infiltration, in order to join ISIS, you had to have a recommendation, and about 400 different people recommended those 706 on the records that we have. And that person was vouching that the recruit was of good character and would do what they were supposed to do and wasn't a bad guy. Now, the smuggling part is important because remember I've said that there's a lot of overlap between insurgency and just outright criminals. The end result is different, but what they do and how they do it usually a lot of times is the same thing, and sometimes they work together. So most of the recruits came in from the Syria-Turkey border. So they left Saudi Arabia, got to Turkey, and then headed south to the Syria-Turkey border. 4 smugglers moved 67% of the recruits, so about 475 of them. 4. And one guy, Abu Muhammad al-Shamali, who's Iraqi but became a Saudi national, smuggled 301 Saudis by himself, despite having to move locations around. So a small, dedicated group of people, smugglers, were able to move a lot of people one direction, and I imagine a lot of loot out of Syria the other way. Some conclusions. Well, the first off is radicals didn't join ISIS. People joined ISIS and became radicals. The theological reasons or justification people would throw out for why people joined ISIS doesn't hold up to the numbers that we see. People became radical after they joined. Now, the messaging. They were able to get their message across to a broad variety of countries and backgrounds throughout the Middle East. And I would say that they used a secular message, a simple secular message. Join us and we will get you a wife or the money to pay for a wife. And that had a huge appeal throughout the Middle East, which is why they were able to effectively recruit, because they were in competition with various other Islamic or Islamic type organizations, such as Al-Qaeda in Syria, the Syrian Liberation Front. But people joined ISIS in much larger numbers. And I posit that it was because of their very simple secular message. Join us and we will get you a wife, or we will get you the money for a wife. A few more conclusions from the article. This third wave of modern jihadists were more diverse and more radical than prior generations. And I mean more radical upon their return. Now, in 2013 2014, more Saudis joined ISIS than Saudis joined to fight in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So one decade, in 1 year, more people joined ISIS as a jihadist from Saudi Arabia than in the entire 1980s to go fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Part of it is proximity, but I would also say part of it is messaging. Most extremists arrive at a belief or conclusion and then start finding evidence to back it up. This is perfectly normal and happens all the time. It's a logical fallacy, but perfectly normal. And lastly, a few of the ISIS fighters who have returned to Saudi Arabia have renounced ISIS. Others, however, a couple additional references here for you if you want to dig into this a little bit deeper. The Combating Terrorism Center at West Point has an article called Bombers, Bank Accounts, and Bleedouts. And then Thomas Heghammer has a nice one on jihad in Saudi Arabia. Excellent resources if you want to dig into this a little bit deeper. Hope you enjoyed that and you understand where I get my idea that marriage, or the pursuit of the resources necessary to get married, is a major driving factor for people in the Middle East. As always, a book recommendation. Vietnam, Spooky and Civil Affairs by Air Force Major Larry Wooster, which surprised the hell out of me because I didn't think the Air Force did civil affairs. But apparently, at least in Vietnam, they did. So when he was a first lieutenant, Larry Wooster was assigned as civil affairs officer in his province, went out and about and tried to pacify the hamlet. Did a pretty good job. It's a book worth reading, a little more modern than some of our World War II ones. So, lastly, of course, if you have any questions, or if you disagree, feel free, back it up with something, feel free, and put it down below or send me an email.